Bibliophiles of the internet, my name is Adri, and today I'm here to offer you 5 reflections on The President and the Frog by Carolina de Robertes. I usually do my 5 reasons to read videos, which is a format of reviewing books that I developed for my channel personally and intentionally, but this book is very different, very ambitious, very abstract, so I wanted to come at it from a different angle and sort of process what this story made me think about. It's still a book review. I'm still going to be talking about how this book resonates with me as a reader, but hopefully in a way that gives the proper amount of space to address the story in the way that it needs. The President and the Frog is the latest forthcoming book from Carolina de Robertes. She is the author of 2 of my favorite books in the world, Cantoras and The Gods of Tango, and this book is coming out from Knopf on August 3rd. The author is Uruguayan-American, and this story, which is a blend of contemporary and historical fiction, centers a former president of an unnamed Latin American country, and the story begins when a journalist comes to his humble home to interview him about the current political climate, his legacy, and also his past. When he was younger, he was a guerrilla revolutionary who was imprisoned for inciting revolution and held in solitary confinement. And in those dark days when he believed himself to be waiting for his own death, he was visited by a frog who spoke to him and gave him a reason to survive. Content warnings for descriptions of imprisonment and inhumane living conditions, some allusions to torture, some non-graphic references to rape, as well as a brief mention of child death and gun violence. The first thing I thought of while reading this book was that it really stands on its own, structurally and aesthetically. It feels overwhelmingly like a parable that unseats, or at the very least challenges, the traditional North American Western gaze. This book not only feels different from the other books I've read from Carolina, but it's different from many books that I've read in the sense that it still has a narrative arc, but it's really carried by one character, and every structural choice is ultimately to drive the message of the story as opposed to the plot. It's the kind of story that's ambitious and expansive. It's not focused on linear storytelling or building up a strong cast of characters. As this former president is giving this interview, he's remembering a very specific time in his life, and the writing definitely reflects the surrealism of memory itself. It's not the kind of story that gives you a detailed look at the entirety of this character's life, which I think we sometimes come to expect, especially in Western storytelling. Sometimes we equate more detail and more backstory with better storytelling, but that's not always the case. This is more so a story where the character is almost secondary to the message, where the character acts as a vehicle for the bigger picture. It's almost the kind of story where the climax is a revelation, an emotion, as opposed to an action. Like I said before, it feels like a parable more than a traditional novel, and parables are stories that exist to impart some kind of moral attitude or lesson. They're stories that give the audience some sort of tangible, concrete idea that they can take away and then apply to their everyday lives or mindsets. I just think the non-linear, non-plot-focused style of narration gives the story something special. It's a very stripped-back sort of structure, but its simplicity does not negate its complexity or its impact. Instead, it heightens the emotion of the storytelling and allows the writing to focus on what's really important. The second thing I appreciate about this story is that the existence of this talking frog is both essential to the story and also not. There's this introduction of surrealism or magical realism when it comes to the titular frog in this story. Is it an animal? Is it a spirit? Is it a projection of this desperate man's imagination? That question is never answered in the story, and it actually doesn't need to be answered for the story to work. Just now I talked about how the storytelling emulates the way memory works, and I feel like this story is a long-form rumination on how memory both reveals and creates the deepest and most essential parts of our personhood. Memories are the stories of our lives, the mythology of our lives, as told by us to ourselves. We grow and we change because of what we've experienced, and the connection this character felt with this frog not only buoyed him in his darkest times, but it also helped him create resolve for the future. So the question of whether the frog exists is actually not important. Part of where the tension comes from in the story is the question of whether this character is going to reveal his memories of the frog with the journalist interviewing him. But as you continue to read, you realize that revealing his truth or his understanding of the truth isn't as important as remembering it. The fact that this president remembers his confinement and his interaction with the frog, whether it's real or not, is something that he carries with him, something that lives in his heart, something that reminds him of the promise he made to himself to care about other people and value life all those years ago when he was trapped alone in the darkness. The frog in many ways saved his life and helped him reconnect with a sense of purpose, and that is more important than the question of its existence. Another thing I realized as I read the story is that it's also asking the question of how we define power, how we create power, and how we exchange power in our everyday lives. The interview portion of this book is taking place place in 2016 in the aftermath of the presidential election here in the US, and I think that puts the story in a really unique position to comment on the international political climate. The disproportionate political power of the US impacts how many people, specifically Western and global Northern audiences, understand the connection between power and politics, specifically how we think that power is intrinsically connected to politics. There's this misconception, especially here in the States, that the US is the most powerful, the most civilized, the most effective political system currently in place, which obviously is laughably false. And furthermore, a lot of people also carry this misconception that other countries outside of the US are living under poor conditions, under tyranny and turmoil that could be fixed if they only implemented our form of democracy, which is a gross romanticization of democracy at best and willful ignorance at worst. This story gives us the opportunity to think about how we understand political power in countries outside of the US. How do we understand resistance, liberal politics, progressive mindsets, when we are forced to reconcile with the fact that these ideas and these movements are not unique to nor originating from the US. The main character in this book is loosely inspired by the real-life Uruguayan president Jose Mujica, who I cannot claim to know a great deal about, but who was very liberal and known colloquially as the anti-politician. The character in this story has similar beliefs and origins, and as I said, he was a guerrilla revolutionary fighting for freedom and power to the people, even if his life was the cost of his resistance. And the story is really not about his time in office. It's not about his presidency, which laws he passed, how he won the election, which policies he fought for, and I think that's what's so profound about it, because the story instead shows how he found his power and resolve at the darkest and loneliest point in his life. If we take politics, violence, control off the table, what then is power? Where does it come from? Where does it live? How do we understand our own power against the backdrop of so much persistent hardship, suffering, and injustice? The story is ultimately building to this revelation that there is power in how we see ourselves. There is power in what we have to offer other people, and there is power in believing that something better should and can exist. Which leads me nicely into my next reflection about how the story is largely about the power of connection. Again, the most impactful moments in this story are not about this character wielding political power. There is an interesting progression of seeing him go from being powerless to being powerful, but that power, again, doesn't come from his presidency, but instead from his own sense of purpose. This character doesn't become powerful when he assumes office. His strength, his courage, his intentionality solidified during that time he spent in confinement, when he understood that continuing to grow the world around him is the antithesis of hopelessness. This might be my thoughts blurring together a little bit, but this story, even with all its surrealism and abstraction, really works because the story understands that we are living in what many would call surreal times. In times of distress, what is real takes on the air of the surreal because we've been told that there should be limits to suffering, inhumanity, and injustice, both individually and collectively, when humanity is actually not predicated on maintaining that kind of moral balance. When you boil it down to the individual, it's easy for us to feel powerless and overwhelmed in the face of all these really difficult, complex, pressing issues that demand and deserve our attention. And it's easy to feel like there's nothing you can do as an individual person that will actually make a difference. That's where this story steps in and tells you to keep fighting, keep learning, keep connecting, because small choices and small moments can actually ripple outwards exponentially. Change ultimately happens because a shift started somewhere with someone. It doesn't just happen because you speak it into existence. Change and hope is a fruit that you can only harvest long after it's been planted. As they say, you don't get to enjoy the fruit the same day you plant the seeds, and planting the seeds looks like so many things. It looks like caring about other people, letting people tell you their stories, believing people, helping people when you can. And even though that seems very small, it actually makes a difference. Feeling connected, realizing that power exists in forms that fortify people instead of hurting them, especially at the interpersonal level, is what gives us the strength to go on. And we have to go on. We have to persist if we want things to change. And finally, the last thing I want to process with you all is how the story is all at once different from Carolina's previous stories, but still very much in conversation with the common themes that reoccur across their work. I say this book is different in part because I'm a big believer in that you have to meet a story where it is. You have to judge a story for what is on the page, not what you think should be on the page. You can't really go into this expecting another Cantoras, expecting a Gods of Tango, expecting something similar to Carolina's previous books, because it is not that. But with that said, it is still a rich, passionate, provocative story that carries her trademark incisiveness and lyricism. It's rooted partially in history, both recent history and more distant history, which is what Carolina does best. They have a way of making history feel so vibrant and alive and urgent. And thematically, The President and the Frog definitely echoes common themes you see emerging in their other stories, like the politicization of human existence, living in a way that challenges societal norms, fighting back against oppression and injustice in ways that are both big and small. And really, I think the heart of this story is liberation. The story asks us not only how we can liberate ourselves from political injustice and harmful systemic frameworks, but how can we liberate ourselves from apathy and hopelessness? How are we to be liberated from pessimism, from passivity, from widespread fear that keeps us locked in place? How do we liberate ourselves from the most pressing danger, which is a sense of isolation? That isolation is made very literal for this character when he's taken prisoner and thrown in this underground cell where he doesn't even know whether it's night or day, and where he never speaks to another living person. We often feel helpless because we feel alone, and we are often made to feel alone. Our loneliness is by design, because when we think that we as individuals are powerless to have any kind of lasting impact, we are less likely to act or change. But the fact is that we are connected, and when we nurture that connection, when we grow that connection, when we are purposeful in that connection, when we care about other people and realize that other people are worth caring for and fighting for, that helps those seeds of change grow. Like all of Carolina's work, this story is about community and solidarity. It's about seeing people for who they are and making the not-so-easy choice to persist and resist. And by the end, I felt as if I had changed myself in the process of once again sharing space with their work. I am certain some people will say this book is unrealistic or idealistic, or it's a romanticization of history or political figures, but those are not really sticking points for me, because everything, as I said, is in service of the message, and having completed the book, I can definitely say, message received. All of that is to say, I'm going to be thinking about this book for quite some time. Hopefully some of this resonates in some small way, because sometimes my videos are just me processing what I've read with myself. But that's okay, because reviews are meant to be part of a larger conversation. They are by no means a destination or an endpoint. If you plan on reading The President and the Frog, or if you've read any of Carolina's other books, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments down below. But that's everything I had for this review today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.